Howdy. Welcome back to Dion Talk. In today's video, I'm going to talk about collecting rent and the three things that I consider when I do that. I have a couple of goals when it comes to running my portfolio. The first one is that I limit tenant turnover because tenant turnover is expensive. The second thing is that I like to make it easy on myself because I'm super lazy. And one of the main reasons that I got into real estate investing was because I was tired of my sources of income being taken away due to things outside of my control. But when I started investing in real estate, my goal was to make an investment, not buy another job. And as lazy as I am, I still self-manage. Someday, I'm going to hire a property manager, but not today. And at the end of today's video, I'm going to talk about my 2 criteria that I use for screening tenants that has resulted in me not having one late or missing payment, even throughout the entire pandemic. So keeping in mind that one of my goals is to limit tenant turnover, that brings me to the first thing I consider when I'm thinking about collecting rents, and that is making it easy on the tenant. The easier it is for a tenant to pay their rent, the less likely it is that they get frustrated and move. When it comes to making it easy for your tenant to pay their rent, sometimes you have to look at it from the tenant's perspective. And depending on the class of property you have, you may attract entirely different people. With Class A, B, and C properties, most of your tenants are going to have bank accounts. With C- and D class properties, sometimes you're going to get tenants that need to pay their rent with a cashier's check. And I will leave a link in the description below to this article by Brandon Turner of BiggerPockets that explains how to tell what class of property that you have. If you have a portfolio of 50 or 100 or 200 units, all of the ways that I collect rent might not be the best option for you. You might want to just pick one of them and go with it. After making sure that the way that I can collect rent is easy on the tenant, the second thing that I consider is making sure it leaves a paper trail, which kind of shows my age. What I actually mean is that electronically there is a date and timestamp somewhere that that payment was made. And all of the options that I give my tenants to pay their rent do that for me. And the third thing that I like to make sure happens whenever I'm collecting rent is that it saves me a trip to the bank. Do you remember when I said I was lazy? In 2020, I recorded all of the time that I spent self-managing my 14 units. And that is everything, from every phone call, every email, every time I do get the one check in the mail from the person who still sends a check and I deposit it with an app, that 5 minutes is recorded. And to self-manage 14 units, it took me a total of 27 hours. If I had to go to the bank to deposit rents, that actually would have been a lot higher. So, like I said earlier, if you have a lot of units, or if you're using a property manager, you might want to pick just one of the ways that I collect rent and make that your standard. But since my portfolio only has 14 units, I will accept payments through Zelle, Apple Pay, Google Pay, ACH, Venmo, Cozy.co, and I'll even take a check, as long as I can deposit it with an app. All of these forms of accepting a payment leaves a paper trail. I can log into my account, search a name, see every payment for the last year. Makes it really easy. For me, the really cool thing about all of these ways of accepting payments is that they're all free. Yes, if you want it immediately or within 5 to 10 minutes, you can pay a small fee. But if you're willing to wait 1 or 2 business days, and for some of them it's usually about 4 hours, it doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't cost the tenant, doesn't cost you. But before you accept payments for rent in any of these formats, first, a warning. If you've been a landlord for more than 10 minutes, you're probably aware that for the most part, people suck. And with a lot of ways of making payments, after the payment is made, there is a way to take that money back. The first thing is something that I learned from something that Mindy Jensen of BiggerPockets Money said. And I swear I want to have a list of Mindy Jensen quotes because I've learned so much from listening to her. Things that she's actually helped me correct in my leases that saved me a headache down the road. But this is one of the things that she said about PayPal. That after a payment is made, the payor can go to PayPal and tell them they didn't want to do the transaction and get the money back. And it wasn't until she said this, or wrote this in a comment, that it dawned on me that in my W-2 job, I've encountered something very similar with a check. I run a truck driving school and somebody went through our program, and in the last week of their training, they made their final payment with a check. 10 days later, they went to their bank and said they didn't want to make the payment. The funds disappeared from our bank account and we had no control over it. So even a check isn't the safest way to go. So while I'll accept all of these various forms of payment, I don't take them for first month's rent or deposit or last month's rent. For those, I want a cashier's check. So to really quick recap the 3 things that I look at when I'm collecting rent. I want to make it easy on the tenant, I want to leave a paper trail electronically, and I want to make it easy on myself because of the lazy. And at the beginning of this video, I talked about how I would explain my 2 criteria for screening tenants that have resulted in me having no late or missing payments ever, even during the pandemic. I'm not counting my first 2 tenants because those happened before I got my systems in place, and they weren't screened right. They weren't screened at all. Almost every time the topic of screening tenants comes up, what I hear over and over and over again is a multiplier of the actual rent. They want their tenants to make 2.5 or 3 times the amount of the rent. And my 2 screening criteria don't include what the person makes. I've never asked, and I don't care. There's a couple of reasons why I don't care. First, I know people making over 6 figures that are late on every bill. And second, a person's reportable income is often not how much they're making. I'm not saying that it's good for people to cheat on their taxes, but how many people know a bartender, waitress, cosmetologist, where the vast majority of their income comes from gratuities? Do you think their actual pay stubs and tax returns shows you what that person's actually making? The 2 things that do matter to me are, first, no evictions ever, not even 20 years ago. Somebody who's forced a landlord to go through an eviction process and has learned how to live in a place for free has learned the system. And second, credit score. A person who's taken the time to get their credit score up is going to protect it. Most landlords that I hear from say that 650 is a good safe credit score, but this depends on your area. Since there's so much demand in my area and I have so many applicants for every property, I require a 700 credit score. One of the things that I do to diversify my portfolio is I rent to about 1/3 military, 1/3 Section 8, and 1/3 is working or retired. But even with military, Section 8, or retired, or anybody, I have tenants with over 800 credit scores applying for those properties. So for me, it's been very easy to find people with a 700 or higher credit score. With just those 2 criteria, they don't ask background questions. I think in some states, you're not allowed to ask criminal history backgrounds, and I don't ask income questions. All the way through the pandemic, and since I've been a landlord after my first 2 tenants, I've never had a late or missing payment because people will protect their credit scores. Last year, in 2020, during the pandemic, I did have one couple that was struggling, and they were able to get 2 months covered by an outside agency that was doing COVID relief. But I was still paid, and it was still on time. In April, when everybody was nervous and nobody was sure what was going to happen and the United States was having its first shutdown, I offered $200 off across the board for all tenants, and about half of them said, no thanks, we're working, and they paid the full price. Outside of that one discount, no one's ever been late and no one's missed a payment. Do me a favor, in the comments below, let me know how you collect rents. What have been the best ways for you? And, if you can, what screening criteria have you used to find the best tenants? I hope I made it worth your time clicking on this video today. If you liked it, if you thought you got anything out of it, please hit like, hit subscribe, share it with a friend. Maybe you can help them. Until my next video, thanks for coming to my Dion Talk.
We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.